All plants need to gather particular resources to survive, and that includes sunshine for energy, water from the soil, various minerals and micronutrients, and also CO2 from the air. And the way that they gather those nutrients is going to be different depending on what type of environment they're in. The ancestors of land plants were algae, and they just absorbed their water and minerals and CO2 directly from the water that they were living in. And early plants were non-vascular, so they had to live in shallow water. They were very, very short. They may have had aerial roots so they could get CO2 and oxygen. And eventually, natural selection favored taller plants because they could shoot up and compete with their nearby plants for light. And that required having vessels to bring sugar down and water up, and also some more solid kinds of materials like cellulose, for instance, and lignin. Most plants that you see now are vascular plants. But again, vascular plants evolved from things like mosses and liverworts, which we still see today, but which have to be very, very short because they can't transport water or sugars very far, and also because they don't have that sturdy tissue to deal with gravity. So the evolution of xylem and phloem were very, very important. Xylem, which transports water from roots to shoots, also minerals that are dissolved in that water, and phloem, which transports sugars or photosynthetic products from sources to sinks. So very often that means from leaves to the rest of the plant, but it could mean from stored areas of sugar, like a tuber, like a potato, or a root, like a carrot, to places where you want to have new growth. And broadly, this is what it looks like, right? We're exchanging gases in the leaves, things like CO2 and oxygen, really in all these tissues. We've got light coming in that we're collecting in the leaves for energy. We're getting water and minerals through the roots. And again, we need CO2 specifically in the leaves in order to use the energy from the light to put together sugars. And we're going to be producing oxygen as a byproduct. But we also need oxygen in many of the tissues of the plants because there are mitochondria in all plant cells. They require oxygen for aerobic cellular respiration and ATP production. And while in the leaves, you're making plenty of oxygen. Down in the roots and in the trunk, etc., you're not. So you need to be taking in oxygen and getting rid of CO2 as well. This is why in really, really wet soils, you can actually drown plants if there's so much water that you can't get oxygen in the roots. All organisms face trade-offs, and in plants, very often, one of the big trade-offs is between enhancing photosynthesis, so access to light and carbon dioxide, and minimizing water loss, because the more sun hits you, usually the more heat hits you, and there's more evaporation and water loss. Similarly, when your stomata are open in your leaves to allow oxygen out and CO2 in, you're losing more water, and so you have to balance those two things because water is also necessary for photosynthesis. This trade-off is going to look different in different environments. If you are in an area where there's lots and lots of water, then you're probably going to have a lot of surface area on your leaf so that you can get as much light as possible. So if you have lots of water and light is limited, maybe it's shady, you want huge, broad leaves. But if you're in a desert area, for instance, light is not a limiting resource. You got plenty of light, but water is going to be a limiting resource. So you want smaller leaves, and maybe you don't want them broadly facing up to the sun. Maybe you want them facing like this. They'll be very waxy with their cuticle so that you lose less water. And very often you're going to see self-pruning. So as lower leaves become shaded and become more of a liability for losing water and less of a production center for sugars, you're just going to drop them. You're going to self-prune. Leaf orientation matters as much as leaf size. In really, really low light conditions, you want broad leaves facing up where the sun's coming from to get as much of that limited light as possible. In really sunny conditions, you may have vertical leaves like this so that you have less of the surface facing the sun, and you're going to lose less water and have less damage by the solar radiation. There's also a trade-off between fast growth and branching out widely, and these are different strategies. So pine trees like this often shoot up quickly so they can outcompete the plants around them for sunlight. And this is why pine tends to have lighter wood, burns more quickly. Something like an oak tree grows much more slowly, so it has a harder time being the first up. But if it grows, it spreads out and shades out anything that might try to grow underneath it and beats out competition that way. So these are two different strategies. Again, trade-off between fast growth and wide growth and branching and shading. Water and minerals are brought into the plant by the roots. And most plants, including dicots, gymnosperms as well, have a taproot system, which is one major root, one primary root that digs down into the soil, and then lateral roots that come off of it, rather than what you find in monocots, which is a fibrous root system, which is lots of similarly sized roots. And roots can adjust to local conditions. So if a root finds an area with a lot of a particular nutrient, like nitrate or water, it may do more branching, so it can absorb more of that there. And roots compete with other roots, but they're more likely to compete with roots from different plants than they are with their own roots. Presumably, that means that they can tell which roots are theirs and which roots are somebody else's. And as we talked about in Chapter 31, plants tend to have mutualistic associations with fungi, and these are called mycorrhizae. Myco meaning fungus, rhizo referring to root systems, and so mycorrhizae are essentially root fungus. And these fungus increase the surface area that are available for absorption of water and minerals, particularly phosphate that the plant can take up. And in return for helping to bring this stuff in for the plant will usually respond by giving them carbohydrates as calorie sources. And this is what that looks like. Each of these individual little white fibers is hyphae, and together it's mycelium, right? Those mats of hyphae. But these are all around and associated with these bigger, thicker roots that you can see. Water and minerals that are picked up by the roots eventually have to make their way into the vascular cylinder, which is in the middle of the root, in the middle of the main root, and then make its way up toward the rest of the plant, like the leaves. And there are two major pathways to get into that vascular cylinder: the apoplast route and the symplast route. In the apoplast route, the water and materials never actually cross a cell membrane to go into a plant cell. They just go through the sort of in-between cell spaces and the cell walls, and this is again called the apoplastic route. If you go into the cell membrane and you go through, and you can go from one cell to the next through these plasmodesmata, which are kind of like gap junctions, except they also go through cell walls. So once you cross that one cell membrane, you don't have to again. This is called the symplast route. So outside of the cell is the apoplast route. Inside the cell across the plasmodesmata is the symplast route. And if you do some combination of both, where you go into a cell but you leave a cell and go back into a cell, this is called the transmembrane route, to get through the area of the root before you hit that vascular cylinder. Just like in animals, plants can move things across the membrane through active transport by using pumps, or by passive transport by using channels that allow things to move across. And they often use the movement of solutes to promote the movement of water, which follows solutes due to osmosis. But whereas animals tend to do this using sodium-potassium pumps, we pump sodium in a particular direction and potassium in the other direction, plants use hydrogen pumps generally. And again, like sodium pumps in animals, hydrogen pumps can be used to create a membrane potential, so a different charge on the inside versus the outside of the cell, to co-transport neutral solutes. So we pump sodium out and then use that flow of sodium back in to move glucose into our cells. They do the same thing with sucrose and hydrogen ions. Also nitrate, for instance. And they also have ion channels. These are not pumps, so they don't require extra ATP, but they do allow ions to move down their concentration gradient. As we mentioned earlier, plants lose a lot of water because they have to be out in the sunshine, photosynthesis, right? But at the same time, they need water to perform that same photosynthesis. So balancing water uptake and loss is very important, and by extension, osmosis is very important. And to understand water movement, it's important to understand water potential, which is a measurement that combines both solute concentration, which causes osmotic movement of water, and also pressure, which can cause movement of water, right? In the same way that a heart pumps, and that compression, that reduction of volume, causes an increase in pressure, and things move from high to low pressure, etc. So water potential accounts for both of those things. And water potential determines the movement of water. And water always flows from an area of higher water potential to an area of lower water potential. And this is called potential because when there are differences, that means there's potential energy. You can perform work. So things like high salinity or low pressure are going to both reduce water potential. You may see this unit megapascals abbreviated like this to talk about water potential. And for pure water with no solutes at sea level at room temperature, it is 0. One way to describe this is that water potential is equal to the solute potential plus the pressure potential. And again, solute potential is proportional to its molarity, so it's total concentration of solutes. And pressure potential is the physical pressure on a solution. Again, like your heart contracting. But in this case, it's less to do with contraction and more to do with cell walls. So as you fill up a plant cell with water, it begins to push out on the cell walls, and the cell walls push back because they're solid. And this creates turgor pressure. So the cell membrane is pushing against the cell wall, and again, the cell wall then pushes back. And this is good. Plants want to be turgid or have lots of turgor pressure because it helps them stand up. If they don't have that, if they don't have enough water, they're wilty. And here you can see if you add solutes to some water, and we have a semi-permeable membrane here that's permeable to water but not solutes, it reduces the water potential there. And again, we flow towards low water potential, so that causes water to flow in here. Now, positive pressure increases the water potential and causes this water to be pushed in the opposite direction. All right, so that makes sense. So solutes lower it, positive pressure increases it. So in this case, you've got an even amount of solute pressure kind of sucking the water toward it and positive physical pressure pushing out, and you end up having the same amount of actual water potential that you do on the other side. These potentials, again, affect the amount of water inside a plant cell. So if you have a flaccid cell, which is a cell, with sort of kind of what an animal cell would look like. So it doesn't have so much water that it's pushing on the cell wall. We call it flaccid. And if you put it in a solution that's very hypertonic, that means this hypertonic solution on the outside is going to have very low potential, and the water is going to leave. And this is then called plasmolysis, where the cell has been plasmolized, where literally the cell membrane has shrunken back from the cell wall. And this is not good for plants. In fact, plants don't even want to be flaccid. They want to be turgid. So if you place this in pure water, then you have more solutes inside the cell, and that means lower water potential, and water is going to flow then inside until you're pushing out on the cell wall, and that, again, pushes back, and the solute potential and the pressure potential sort of even each other out, and you have a really solid plant cell. And again, if all the plant cells are doing this, then the plant is no longer wilty, it's standing upright. So generally, plants want to be in more pure water in a hypoosmotic situation. And like in animals, the movement of water is greatly sped up across cell membranes by aquaporins, which are transport proteins in the cell membrane that allow easy passage of water, which is a polar molecule, across the nonpolar membrane. Now, water can move across a little bit otherwise because it's small, but it can't move across effectively without these protein channels, aquaporins, which again are also found in animals and affect water flow in us.